Hello everyone. So welcome to I suppose series revisited. It's been a while since I've done specifically an Album Musings episode. The series sort of, I suppose, wrapped up technically or morphed into something else around about, last one was May 30th, 2023, so last year. Oh, sorry, March. So yeah, around this time last year, because it sort of evolved into a series of other series, things like the Joy of the Rediscovered Album and various other album-related stuff. But I was thinking a lot about the albums that I picked when I did that series, and why I picked them at the time. And they very much tied into stuff that had, I suppose, reached a certain time frame. So I think I was using the term eventually decennial albums. So that's album where it's either like 10 year, 20, 30, 40, 50 year anniversary. So, I was doing stuff from 83, 93, because it was 2023, stuff like that, 73. And, but all the albums that I tended to pick, I think bar a couple, I noticed were albums that I'd listened to again and again over the years. And quite a number of them were albums that I was, I suppose, slow to the party for. Not all of them, but some of them. So I've been thinking a lot about that recently, where there's been a bit of a lag on me getting into an album. Not by much, by like a year or so. I'm not talking about a massive lag. And then I just revisit the album over and over again. So it doesn't really warrant inclusion directly for, say, a Joy of the Rediscovered Album, because I just listened to the album too much on and off. And I got thinking about this album. So what happened was, I do this thing where when I do my visit to the hygienist, which is a sort of bus ride to get there, so when those visits come up there every 6 months, what I do is I get a lift over there, because I always book an early appointment. So I sort of go over with another family member who'll be driving over that time of day anyway. But on the way back, I hop on the bus, and I just take the bus to the nearest terminal to where I live and then walk back. And I sort of plan my walk, so it's about an hour. And what I tend to do when I'm doing stuff like that, and it's not that's the only time I sort of will take the bus back from the city and then sort of walk back from a terminal if the weather's not too inclement. But yeah, particularly on those sort of trips. So I pick an album, and also I do this thing where I've still got a functioning old school, like iPod Classic. I think it was maybe the last generation of iPod Classic they made. So, it's got pretty large space on it. And I dig that out. It's got all my old CDs ripped on there, and I decided to go on a bit of the Stone Roses album Jag, where I literally just got on the bus, put it on, and was like staring out the window, and just lost in the music. And this, where I'm going to sort of dip into this series again of album musings now and again. I think that's going to be that's the sort of category of album I want to do now with these, is albums that just I get lost in, and they're favourites of mine for doing that, just taken to a different place. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about this album, what it means to me, what was going on when it came out. A little bit about the fact that it's a bit of a relatively slow burn for me on this, and it took me about a year before I really picked up on it, even though it was there in the background and the band were regularly releasing singles. Yeah, so, and I get off the bus, going back to the story, and then I then deliberately plan my route, my walk from there, so that it's about an hour. So I get a nice hour walk, which is longer than it would be if I was to walk as straight as I could. I think it's about 45 minutes if I took the straightest route possible. But the route I took allows me to sort of go slightly onto a trail, stuff like that. Still listening to this album, repeating it over, because it's how long is this album actually in its original form? It's been reformatted a couple of times, I think. Yeah, so it doesn't say, interestingly enough. Huh. Okay. I think it's probably about a 45-minute album. If I bring it up on Spotify off screen, what does it say is the length of the album? Yeah, that's got Fool's Gold on it as well. Yeah, so the version on Spotify has an additional track, Fool's Gold, which is a great track. My copy of the album that I've got is a CD of the 89 release, which doesn't have Fool's Gold on it. Yeah. So 58 minutes with Fool's Gold, and that's a nearly 10-minute song actually. So yeah, it's around a 48-minute album. Yeah, so awesome album. Eventually, yeah, it went 5 times platinum in the UK. But what's fascinating is I didn't quite realise how. So at the time this came out, let me just think about this. So let me get into my 1989 headspace. So May 1989, where was I? I would have still been working in a lab. At that point that's right, I had my own little department. I was, what was my job title? It was quality support project leader. Yeah. So I was doing customer complaints and developing internal computer solutions, like programming solutions for document management and quality management, various types of stuff, and dabbling actually back then in what would it be called back then? So yeah, decision support systems, but really old school, where it's all like rules based, none of this fancy neural nets. Although saying that, I have a book from around, just after that, probably early 90s, which talks a lot about neural networks. They've been around for a long time, and I did actually get interested in it because I was curious as if you could use it. We were using matrices to do bacterial identification, and like probability matrices, and I was really curious as to whether you could train a neural net to identify bacteria. But at that point it was all hardware based and it was really expensive, so it wasn't something I pursued. But yeah, so that's where I was work wise, and so at the time probably my youngest brother was biggest into this whole, like, what would you call it, like dance rock The indie rock had taken an interesting turn and absorbed a lot of dance stuff. So Stone Roses were in this really interesting, part of this interesting scene, this Manchester scene, which had sort of grown over time, and you can sort of join the dots through, Manchester bands over the decade, going from, late 70s into the 80s and then into the 90s. So the sort of bands I'm thinking about would be bands that were associated with Tony Wilson. So, New Order, but, particularly Factory Record stuff, and Hacienda. And I'm going to include some links to some really interesting documentaries about that sort of early, the early scene there, and all the people involved in the early days. And then you sort of get into the Smiths, and then from the Smiths, then moving into bands like the Stone Roses, Happy Mondays, Charlatans, I think. Well, I'm not sure which part of the country the Charlatans were from. But yeah, this whole scene, which we'll have a look at in a moment. And so, and then a lot of this sort of gets retrospectively assigned. Like at the time, in '89, I can remember the term indie, just to obviously refer to bands that were on independent labels. And I was aware that, psychedelia, like a lot of bands around that time, had absorbed psychedelia into their sound. So this whole neo-psychedelia thing. And then you got terms like alternative rock. I don't know whether that was more of a retrospective assignment, because I didn't really come across that yet, I suppose. Yeah, it's pretty close though, isn't it? Because I started hearing bands being tagged as alternative rock around the time, I suppose, of Soundgarden and Pearl Jam, and I suppose to some degree Nirvana. Although, obviously you've got, it's probably the term grunge there more, but I'm probably thinking more, certainly bands more in the mould of Soundgarden, who had much more like heavier sound, but similar bands that grew out of that or were associated with that grunge scene, being labelled alternative rock. There's always a problem, isn't it, when you go on and look these up? Some of these terms have applied retrospectively, but certainly Manchester was a term that people were using at the time, and again psychedelia and just the term indie. So musically, I was at a really interesting crossroads, I think, when I was listening to or got into this album, because, like I said, the album dropped. My youngest brother was really into sort of, indie dance scene. I remember him being really into, what would it have been around this time? So sort of rave and bands like Stone Roses, and to some degree later Nirvana. And I remember him having, I think on tape, someone had taped him a copy of an early Soundgarden album. But then he was mentioning other bands at that time, which I didn't really clue into until a lot later, like bands like the Electro Hippies, who are more of a sort of proto grindcore band, I think. So, members of that went on to form Carcass. But we'll see when we go through this. I noticed as I was putting these tabs together that it was a really interesting environment in the UK music-wise around '89 in terms of stuff that was there, just in the UK scene, but stuff that was coming in from, say, the States as well. So we'll have a look at that around that time. So I probably didn't get into this album, pick up on it, until sometime in the really early 90s, like 1990, 1991. And that was as a result, I'd heard all the singles, so I did really like Fool's Gold and Made of Stone. And then what happened was, my local, but there's a pub that I used to frequent, which a friend of school, way back when I was at junior school, his dad owned, and this friend of mine worked there. He ran the pub. So his dad owned it, but he ran it. And it went from being a sort of pretty much regular pub. This, by the way, I'm talking about the Shelley Arms in Nutley. Went from being a fairly regular pub, used to be a coaching house back in the day. And went from fairly regular pub to him having live bands there. But the other thing they had was a really cool CD jukebox, and they had the album on there, and this really cool track came on, and it had the drum. I'm thinking, so at that time I was really getting interested in composition. I was sort of jamming with friends and writing music and listening to a lot of different styles of music. And I'm listening to this song and I'm thinking, wow, that's got the drum beat almost to like Pretty Woman on it. So it's like, okay. And so that piqued it made my ears prick up. And then into the song, and the song's 8 minutes 12 long. It launches into this awesome solo. So there's like not really a breakdown, but there's sort of a bridging piece. And then suddenly there's this extended solo, and it just completely blew me away. And then literally within a couple of days, I go out and bought it on cassette, and then ultimately rebought it on CD. So I will look at the chart as well in a moment. The other thing that's amazing with the Stone Roses, and we'll look at the lineup, it always felt like there was a really short period where they burned really brightly. Yeah, and I was quite surprised that where did it say here? It said somewhere as I'm reviewing this. Yeah, it wasn't an immediate success. The album grew popular alongside the band's high-profile concert performances, which also helped them establish as features of the Manchester and the Baggy. So let me just click them up, and we'll talk about that, because I don't know if anybody in watching this from, say, North America may have possibly you've heard of Manchester, but you may not have heard of Baggy. There was also, what was this? There was another term as well. Yeah, around there's all these interesting genre terms, which were also connected with a sort of street culture look, in the same way you get with goth. To me, there's always two parts to goth. There's the music, and then there's the sort of aesthetic. And it's interesting, back in the 80s with goth, there are a lot of people that were aesthetically were goths, but liked quite a broad range of music. So it was interesting with some of these scenes that sort of grew out of the late 80s. Also had this sort of could have quite a musically diverse group of bands which were put under the same, under the same tent. So yeah, I noticed there was a little bit of a kickback as well. I mean, when it came out, it's always interesting when they talk about legacy and reappraisal. So it's almost like one of those albums where it was really popular with a certain group of individuals within the UK, my brother included. But outside of that, people didn't necessarily warm to it. But like I say, it took me a time, but yeah, I got really big into it and just couldn't stop playing it. And like I say, recently, I find that's the great thing with this album is I start playing it and go, yeah, this album's awesome. And I just keep playing it like, about the third time round. It's got this really interesting sound to it as well, production-wise. It's quite, to me, it sounds quite reverby. There's a sort of, not distance is the wrong word, but when I'm listening to it, I love listening to it on headphones actually. But I was interested the pushback they got, particularly around this was it Music of the Millennium, which I wasn't aware of until I read this article, where it came out number 2, and it got real pushback from the presenters. Now, it's rather ironic. So this was actually a vote that was done with a certain demographic of but the general public. So it wasn't like, I mean, I'm pretty ambivalent to polls, and what I mean by that is I don't get bent out of shape when my favourite band or a band that I think should be on a top 100 list are in the list. I don't really care. I don't use lists like that. I actually use them for music discovery. So I actually prefer it when bands I like don't get on the lists, because it gives me something new to think about and think, well, why are people thinking this is a really cool thing? But I do tend to prefer lists that are produced by polls of music fans, rather than just polls of critics or writers of a magazine. I mean, they're useful. I mean, I love the Decibel list every year, but I've always really liked public polls. But this was actually polled to a certain demographic. So, I mean, critical of the album's inclusion in the top 100 and attributed it to the generation of listeners who voted rather than the record's quality. Yeah, but at the end of the day, if you like an album, that's the whole point of in my eyes, that of getting on the list. So, yeah. And I wouldn't call them an okay group actually myself, but there you go. So we'll have a look at that list in a moment, see what all the argument was about. But it was funny looking back through this. I mean, subsequently, it gets on all these various lists, which again, you can just view them how you like. As I said, I don't particularly get hot under the collar about albums being on lists or not on the list or whatever. I'm more interested in, like if I see an album that's on there that what I hadn't previously seen. I did quite like it actually. I had a number of these before I bought the 1001 albums, which I find really helpful actually. I had a number of other albums that were produced by that I think are sort of subsets of some of Colin Larkin's lists, and like I think there was a Virgin one and another one I had, and I found I got a bit fed up with them because it was always the usual suspects on there. And then there was a sort of almost like a reappraisal of everything, where the list started to get much broader, and so I started to see stuff on there that I hadn't seen before. Like one of the things that used to annoy me with some of the lists I saw in terms of not particular bands being on there that shouldn't be, but just this Usual Suspects thing. When I'd sort of get a list, and it would be, the top 10 would be probably just 3 bands. And then I don't know when it started changing, but I started seeing these lists where stuff would get in there that I wasn't aware of, which is really cool. Like, I remember that's how I got into What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, a situation like that where I picked up a book which had, I think that is the number 1 album. After, seeing various books where, number 1 was a Beatles album, and there were multiple Beatles albums in the top 10, and, when there wasn't the Beatles albums, it was probably, as much as I liked them, it was probably like Radiohead or someone like that. So it's been cool over the years to see lists get swapped around a little bit, and you don't end up with the Usual Suspects on there. So interesting article to read and follow up, I think, on all these different classic album awards and stuff like that. Again, just I think with a lot of these you have to take a bit of a laid back view of them often. So Manchester, a pretty thin time, late 1980s, early 1990s. Stone Roses, Happy Mondays and Spiral Carpets. The Charlatans, James, 808 State. And so Hacienda did actually start up quite a bit before this. So that was up and running. But also you can see his connections to Tony Wilson and Factory Records, and, you've got pre-Manchester, so the Smiths, New Order, The Fall, bands like that. So 82 Hacienda opened. And then you got other bands like Cabaret Voltaire, who I was sort of quite big into in the sort of late 80s for a period. So I'll include a link to that. And then this Baggy. So many of them were from the Manchester scene. So it's like an indie dance scene, I suppose. Balearic beat. So, and definitely inspired by DJs playing a mix of rock, dance, crossovers, stuff coming in, I suppose, from rave. And also there was, you saw, I suppose, early movement of this. If you're, say, I don't know, a big New Order fan, and you've listened to them from the early days, so you have Movement, and then Power, Corruption and Lies, and what was after that? Was it Low Life, I think? And then we'll see the album actually after that. I've forgotten what came next after Low Life, what couple of albums there were, but you could see them moving and integrating dance music. And I'll include some links to a documentary that they were involved with, where they talk about that whole period where they got really interested in the dance scene over in the States. That was always there. And then you got other bands like Soup Dragons as well. But the reference to Baggy was this look. I don't remember. The flared jeans, the tie-dye, and then the fishing hat. I don't know whether they still had fishing flies on them or not, but the fishing hat. Yeah. Oh, this is bringing a big smile to my face. It's sort of remember this band, this period, Baggy. Derivative forms, Britpop. Acid House was pulled into it. So, that's why, I was saying this had quite a cross-section. in parallel with this as well, there was like a, what would you call it? I'm trying to think. Yeah, I don't know really the best way to describe it, but there was a crusty scene as well, it was more bands that were into folk rocky stuff, probably heavier things, but there was almost like an acid house crossover as well. Okay, so actually let me do that. So I mentioned about, I'll include the list. So this is the Music of the Millennium list, published in 1998. I like how these create these lists before the millennium actually had ended. So if you released an album in the last 2 years, it didn't get counted. So take what you want from that. There was a lot of millennium stuff coming out actually in 98. I seem to remember. That was around the time I think The People's Century, which is one of my favourite documentaries, came out as well, close to then. But yeah, pretty interesting list. There's the top 10. Oasis get in there. 2 Radiohead albums, 2 Beatles albums, Stone Roses, Oasis, Nirvana, Van Morrison. 3 Beatles albums. My mistake. 3 Beatles albums. So just out of curiosity, that's a great album. If you've never checked that out, check out that album. That's good as well. Oh, and so is that Blue Line's Massive Attack. Yeah, there's lots of good stuff here actually. But again, lots of stuff that didn't get on the list. Okay, let's see how this did in the UK charts. So it got on the charts fairly quick. So what I said March, didn't I? It came out. So May of 89. And then December here. So, yeah, that's when it really hit the charts. So that probably makes a lot of sense because, gets on the charts, then starts ending up, like I said, on how I heard it was on a jukebox in one of my favourite sort of local pubs where they had bands in there as well playing live, although mainly local bands. Although I did see some, bands that were either on the ascendancy or on the descend. I think I definitely saw at the Shelley Arms, UK subs there quite late on in their career. And Becky and the Bombshells. So Becky would have been originally in Vice Squad back in the day. I didn't see it, but I think there was a Zig Zig Sputnik gig there, and I believe there was a Cutting Crew gig there, or some just before they went really big, because Nick Van Eden and the Drivers used to play locally in Sussex, and I'm pretty sure they played the Shelley Arms at some point. And just before they got really huge, or around that time when the single got big, I Died in Your Arms. So yeah, let's look, just see that, the highest charting. I noticed that there's also, I think it just says Stone Roses, like there's another release that is independently done on this chart. Okay, Hanging Tough New Kids. So where are we? 1990. Yeah. Oh, Soul to Soul, Martika, De La Soul, Technotronic. Oh yeah, there's lots of dance stuff around. Stone Roses. I love this album. This is an awesome album. We'll get to see what I was actually listening to in a moment as well. You know, when this came out, because like I said, there was a bit of a delayed reaction getting into the album. So I'm always curious as to, you know, what was I listening to? So yeah, Gloria Estefan. I was on a bit of a pop jag, but it was quite an eclectic, well, as a lot of years became for me, probably post about mid-80s. It was quite an eclectic period. I wasn't really big into this band. I saw the previous band that the singer was in, the House Martins, down in Brighton in 86, I think. Yeah. Okay. I can never remember if that has one of my favourite Eurythmics tracks. I actually really like the first two albums, but my favourite track is When Tomorrow Comes. It's got a really cool guitar solo on it, but I can't remember if it's on this album or not. I remember this. Oh, yeah. Was that the third Tears for Fears album? Don't remember buying that at the time. Oh, crikey, yeah, this was out. Right. But that might have been out a while. I had this album as well. So some of these may not have come out this year. Now we're getting down the road. I remember this album and this album, although this one took me about 6 months, I think, to get into. So, yeah. I remember we used to jam at this scout hut, and we were, I think, we just swapped drummers, and our new drummer had this Pump t-shirt. This Aerosmith t-shirt. Right, so let's go through. Okay, so Stone Roses. I'll include a link to this. So yeah, this Second Coming album came out in 94. I did buy that when it came out. I actually quite like that album. Quite Led Zeppelin sounding in places, actually, to me. Yeah. Yeah, at least the guitar work for some reason reminded me, I don't know why, of Jimmy Page. I'll have to read into it and find out why, but I remember at the time thinking that. I probably listen back to it now and it doesn't sound, but yeah, I haven't listened to this. I haven't listened to the second album much, apart from when I initially bought it. Yeah, they ran into this real problem, didn't they, with their record label. So that obviously didn't help. In fact, probably by this time, I probably lost track of them a little bit. And then it came out and thought, oh, I should check the album out. Yeah. Oh, here we go. Yeah, I was going to look at the timeline. So, yeah, they were. It's funny how you remember things. Like, you know, this is the period here that I sort of really remember. But, yeah, they were kicking around since 83. And they did reform for a period of time. But yeah, this is the lineup I remember. So Ian Brown, John Squire, Manny and Rennie. And then this band as well, the Seahorses. So this is where John Squire ultimately ended up. And I did buy the Do-It-Yourself album, but they didn't seem, to me, they didn't seem like they were around for that long. But it's a good album, I think. I really like it. They had some tracks off it that seemed to do really well. And I in the UK, certainly, I just got the impression that they were really popular. And the sort of college kids, university kids at the time. But again, I could be wrong. But that's the impression I sort of got. Love is the Law, Blinded by the Sun, Love Me and Leave Me. When did this come out? Did I say 97? So I can remember listening to this album whilst driving around to different clients. At this point, I just left. So this came out, and then late 97, I went from my job at Radio Rentals to working for a startup doing coding. And I remember driving around visiting clients because we were sort of involved in the specification work as well, because it was just me and my boss basically in this little office in Eastbourne. And certain albums just remind me of, at the time, like driving around. This is one, the Seahorses. The other one is a quite a bit later Madonna album, although that was more, I think, towards when I was working for myself. But certainly this album I played a lot. Okay, let me just I wanted to get a feel for, like I said, a bit of a delayed reaction to the album. So what was I actually picking up on in '89? So I can't remember when I got into the Pixies, but it was probably around here. So I think I bought Doolittle when it came out. I don't remember buying this album. My brother had a copy of this. Someone had taped for him. My youngest brother, same one that was into the Stone Roses. He hadn't started listening to Nirvana yet. That wasn't until Nevermind. And I wasn't aware of Slint either. I didn't become aware of them, and retrospectively. I wasn't really big into this period of Queen. That one I definitely remember buying. I hadn't really kept up with Rush. So this I bought when it came out. So, because 89, there was a little bit of a... so was it hair metal was still a thing, wasn't it? Because the sort of grunge, killed that off, I suppose. We were still seeing stuff filtering through. So there's the first Skid Row album. Lenny Kravitz's Let Love Rule. And just like Chris Isaak's album. Okay, so there's lots I recognise here. I know my middle brother was big into Stevie Ray Vaughan. I'm just really looking here at the albums that bubble up to the top on the album of the year. It's quite a good idea, a good way of me getting a quick snapshot of like what was big around there and trying to lock into that and remember. But so in terms of rock stuff, I was definitely listening to the Pixies and indirectly hearing Soundgarden. Definitely listened to Aerosmith, because I also bought, although I was a bit delayed buying this album, I bought the previous album, Permanent Vacation. I had that album, so listened to a bit of Alice Cooper. I remember, recording a show they did a bit later. They must have played somewhere like Castle Donington or Reading, and it was recorded on the BBC, but I think it was a little while after this album. I had someone I worked with later, actually thinking about it, that was big into Skid Row. So if we move through here, let's look at metal. Okay, so now we're getting stuff. So I definitely bought this album when it came out. Hadn't got into Ministry at that point. It wasn't until I heard the track New World Order, which was the album after this, I think. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of this I didn't get until later, actually, looking at this. I did buy this when it came out, so definitely on this list so far, what would it be? Faith No More, Testament. So I was still listening to, I suppose, like thrash, the big four. So yeah, Exodus had this album. Both me and my middle brother were big Exodus fans. And this, Candlemass. I was starting to listen to Candlemass around this time. Oh, and this album as well. So yeah, definitely getting interested, I think, in crossover. So yeah, my middle brother, again, we were big DRI fans at the time. I remember tracking down that, I don't know if it was specifically this time, there's that really good DRI live, where I had it on VHS. So yeah, so definitely still into thrash and slowly going into doom, but I hadn't picked up on the death metal at this point, I don't think. I skipped over this Voivod album, so I'm trying to think when I got into them, because in terms of the bands here, like where I picked up on them, Morbid Angel not until Blessed Are the Sick, I think, and Sepultura not until Arise. I wasn't really keeping up with Motley Crue. Oh, and Obituary not until Cause of Death. So yeah, Annihilator not until the next album. I became aware of them. Was it Is it Neverland? I can't remember what it's called now. Yeah. Atheist, didn't they? I'm trying to remember, because this would have been, I was trying to remember whether Death would have had, they must have had Scream Bloody Gore out by this time. So, because wasn't Chuck using, I know he used the guys from Cynic as his backing band, I think, on one tour. Did he use Atheist guys? Any Florida death metal aficionados there? Can you just jog my memory for me? Which bands sort of helped out with death tours or death albums? I know Cynic, I think, helped out. I don't know if Atheist did. And of course, was it around the time of Leprosy, which was a little bit later, Death Leprosy? Was that, which album did what's that guitarist that also played with Obituary, played on an Obituary and a Death album? James Murphy. Yeah, God dear me, my brain's not too bad this morning. Okay, yeah, this certainly brings back memories. Oh, Sarcophago, wow. Oh, this one. So yeah, I was still, so this was, there's a bit of a UK thrash scene. It was a bit delayed in the UK. So yeah, the Onslaught. Who else was there? Oh, Acid Rain was another one. And who else? I'm a bit more influenced by pagan stuff. Sabat. Yeah, Sabat. Although I don't know when the Sabat album came out. It might have been a little bit later. But yeah, I remember I played this all the time, and we kept on about it at work. I had there was a couple of people I'd worked with in the lab I used to be the supervisor of before I sort of went off and was given my own domain, my own darkness for a period of time, and both of them were like rabid music fans, and really listened to lots of different music. And I remember we'd always be talking about this album, In Search of Sanity. Oh, this is great. This is really bringing in a real big smile. I did see Let's Rock It there, but didn't get into them until... Yeah, there were these... I don't know if second wave thrash metal would be a right term at that point, but, you know, you had bands like... they would probably been going as long as the other bands, but bands like Let's Rock It, and was it Forbidden? And there was another band connected with Forbidden as well, whose name I forget. Was it Violence? One of them had Rob Flynn in of Machine Head fame, ultimately. So there was a whole load of bands that were around there that had peaked a little bit later. So, you know, they lined up, I suppose, with the UK thrash scene, but they were from the States, and they sort of peaked a bit after the other bands had their big breaks. So I remember this album, Secrets in a Weird World Rage. Yeah. What else we got? Punk. I don't remember that much stuff. I mean, I think I bought a Gorilla Biscuits album a bit later. I remember my youngest brother, like I said, going on about the electro hippies. I never listened to them. I don't know which of his friends was listening to them. And I remember hearing about Extreme Noise Terror as well, although I don't think from him. So what you see here is the sort of stirrings of UK grindcore, which sort of existed in parallel with death metal. So... Oh yeah, Sore Throat. Oh God. But none of this I bought when it came out. I mean, I do have this album. I probably need to listen to some electro hippies, actually. I haven't done that. Yeah, I brought this up because I remember, I was definitely listening to some electronic stuff. I never really liked this album when it came out. I don't know why. It never sounded quite heavy enough to me. I was just trying to think whether I'd started to listen to much industrial. I don't think I listened to much industrial until probably Ministry, maybe. But when I heard this album, someone played it to me, and it always sounded a little bit lightweight. And then I got into them later. I sort of got into the real sort of darker stuff. I'm trying to think of what the album was after this, and then the Downward Spiral. That's when I got into 9 Inch Nails, and then I bought this retrospectively. But yeah, never really got it at the time. I had this Pump Up the Jam. I think, I may have been listening to SPK at this point. Maybe just prior to this, actually. So I was aware of a lot of like German industrial bands, whose names I'm not going to attempt to mangle, but I think you know who I mean. Was it Ernsteisen Neubatten? Probably mangled that, but yeah. So hadn't quite got into KMFDM by then. I remember picking up a industrial sampler around the time of the mid 90s? No. It was, probably actually the late 90s, thinking about it. That had a lot heavier bands on it. And KMFDM were one. What else was on there? I think Scorn, which is a band from the drummer from Napalm Death, actually. And like an industrial band. Wow. What else? Pop. Yeah, listening to a lot of what would be, because pop, I mean, again, looking at this through a UK lens, yeah, pop's got a pretty broad church. But yeah, bought this when it came out. Yeah, both me and my little brother were big New Order fans. Who else here? Didn't really keep up with Prefab Sprout. I think I bought their first, 2, maybe 3 albums. Had that. Oh, I remember buying this. I love this album. It's an awesome album. Yeah, I was definitely on a bit of a sort of, female singer jag, I think. So Belinda Carlisle, Gloria Estefan. I'm trying to think who else would have been big around 89. Hadn't really got into Texas at that point. They were pretty successful off the back of this album. I remember listening to this album a lot because a friend of mine who was a professional cyclist would be overseas quite a bit in France and other parts of sort of mainland Europe, and he often would come back with albums. I think I've told this story before. Go, have you checked this band out? So I remember it was through him that sort of I was already slightly into, so going through this happened a lot in the 80s. So I remember him coming back with the Joe Satriani album, who I'd already sort of listened to one track, and then it got played to death in the car when we used to drive around clubbing. And I remember, getting a lot deeper into Joe Satriani because of that. And then, what else was there after that? But there were several, and this was another one. I didn't buy the album, but I remember him playing this album, Road to Hell, a lot. Oh, the other one, was Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Again, slightly earlier, I think. What's this? Oh, more pop albums. Yeah, no. So, real mixed bag, but it would definitely has now come out that, I was listening to a lot of thrash and late to the party thrash. I was trying to think of a good term. I'd like to say I'm not sure whether it's considered to be second wave or not. Yeah, I had this album. It was awesome album. She also sung on the Bomb the Bass album, I think. That's how I got into her. Because I bought the album on vinyl and then noticed she'd been credited, I think, as singing on the track. There's also a connection to her between Nina Cherry and Bristol Scene, Massive Attack. So, yeah. But hip-hop wise... Yeah. I think this album. Yeah, I had this album. Bought that. Tone Loc. Yeah, I mentioned about Manchester. So there we have it. That's me just riffing around and reminiscing on sort of, getting into this album, but also, that year of 89 before I really got into this. I didn't get in, like I said, until probably 1990, 91 maybe. But what was distracting me, I suppose, and definitely looks like it was thrash. What I should do, actually, let's just have a quick look, seeing as I'm this far in. Very quickly, I did have something else off screen actually that I was using to help me out a little bit. Let me just bring it up. So I just want to refresh my memory in case there's any albums I didn't think about that came out that year. Yeah, there was I was still into, I don't know how many people know this band, so a band called New Model Army released an album called Thunder and Consolation. Yeah, definitely bought that when it came out. So yeah, there's the Exodus album, January. Technique by New Order. Yeah. I'll quickly scan down, see if there's anything I haven't really mentioned here. Oh yeah, I remember buying this when it came out. Yeah, they had a documentary done. So yeah, 101. Like a Prayer, I mentioned that already. Yep, Sepultura, Not Until Arise. Yeah, I think I bought this one, Doolittle, when it came out actually. Yeah, several of the ones I've already spoken about. Didn't know. Wasn't really aware of this until later. Yeah, and Sodom, they're this sort of German thrash. That's a whole other thing as well. Creator. I got into them a bit earlier actually. They just sounded so heavy to me. I actually bought one of their albums and that was about it at the time. I think it was probably the second album, but they just seemed too heavy for me at the time. It's funny, I probably listen to it now and think, oh, this is nothing. I remember this EP that came out, because I still would have been listening to the usual suspects like Slayer and Metallica, Megadeth, and did I say Slayer? Yeah, Anthrax as well. So yeah, I went on a bit of a psychedelic furs jag in the mid-80s when I went to see them live. A lot of this stuff actually I recognise. I remember this album. Yeah, I had a friend who was big into Yngwie around this time. That was their sort of university band at the time they got into. Yeah, we already mentioned that. Because I definitely think I was very thrash oriented at this point. I can't remember if I had that album or not. I think I probably did. Oh yeah, there's the Acid Rain album. I had a friend at work that kept on about Acid Rain. I think they actually went to see them live. I wasn't going to see many big bands at this point. I was mostly checking out bands like locally. It's an early Carcass album. Second album. Yeah, so we can see the stirrings of grindcore. Did I have that album? Not sure. I know I had the Wasp album. I did mention that. Oh, Mr. Big, yeah. I remember this album, so yeah. And Zentrix. Yeah, so I was in this weird sort of late thrash hair metal zone in terms of that sort of stuff. In terms of like well-established bands that were kicking stuff out, I mean, I don't know who was the singer, was Black Sabbath at that point, but Headless Cross album came out that year, which I really like actually. I actually quite like all the periods of Sabbath for various reasons. The collaboration album was a little weird. What is it? Forbidden. But it's got, it's an interesting concept, I suppose, with all the guest vocalists on it. But yeah, There was also quite a pretty cool Martin Gore album, who's one of the members of Depeche Mode, Counterfeit EP, which is a covers EP. That's really good. I bought that when it came out. What's this? So yeah, newly formed bands. So I don't know if you noticed their Cathedral had only just formed. Oh, that's another one. Osric Tentacles, Pungent Effulgent. I was just probably a couple of years down the line, but again, another band where I heard them on a pub jukebox in a different pub where I used to go and see bands, and thought, wow, this band sound awesome. They with sort of space rock, extended jam, bits of Hawkwind, and I just thought they were great. Yeah. Another band, actually, if you like, sort of proggy, spacey stuff, and you haven't listened to that band, Osric Tentacles, yeah, they're worth checking out. There was also a band called Wolfsbane in '89. It had an album called Live Fast, Die Fast, which I think I have had on cassette, and the member of Wolfsbane was the vocalist went on to be the vocalist in Iron Maiden for, was it 2, maybe 3 albums, I think. Yeah, that's all I can really remember. So, thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in a future video.